approach. We're going to deploy the virtual machine. That's stage 1. And then the second stage is to go ahead and do some initial configuration for that virtual machine. We're going to use ESXi 4 at the IP address of .104 for this install. I'll go ahead and walk you through it in this demo. And then later in this set of videos, I'll give you a chance from scratch to do the full installation and configuration of the vCenter server appliance on your own. So without further ado, let's go to the install for vCenter server appliance. So we're going to install vCenter server appliance, launching the install from our Windows computer. That's where we're at right now. This is DC NUG. And in this D drive, I've got the installer software, the ISO, for vCenter server appliance to do the actual install. Now our target's going to be ESXi 4. And before we roll this out, I just want to do a quick check regarding DNS to make sure we have forward and reverse lookups for all of our ESXi and vCenter players. So to do that here on DC NUG, I'm going to open up Server Manager, which is this icon down here near the bottom on the taskbar. There's other ways of launching DNS Manager as well, but that's certainly one of them. And then from the Tool menu bar up here in the upper right, we'll click on Tools, and then from the drop down, we'll select DNS. Here we have our forward lookup zones, and then we have the nuggetlab.com. I've got ESXi 1, 2, and 3 in the vCenter server appliance. You know what's not here though? What is not here is ESXi 4. Now, it's not too critical, but you know, just to follow the general really good rules of making sure everything's resolvable, I'm going to go ahead and right-click and add a new host record for ESXi-4. And that is going to be at 192.168.1.104. That's going to be the ESXi host that's going to be the home for our vCenter server appliance that we're about to deploy. So also I have the checkbox for create an associated pointer record for reverse lookup. I'll click on add host, and I'm going to click OK there, and then verify that the record's there. There's our A record. And I'm also going to go to the reverse lookup zones and verify there's a reverse lookup record there as well. So what we should be able to do, and this is an important step, I would recommend doing it even in a lab environment, making sure DNS is working. I'm just going to bring up a command prompt here on the Windows server and just run ns lookup. So this DNS server is pointing to itself as the DNS server. So we should be able to do a forward lookup like vCSA, that works, or vcsa.nuggetlab.com. That works, great. And we should also be able to do a reverse lookup by putting in an IP address of 192.168.1.104. And that should say, hey, that's ESXi 4. Great. I just want to make sure that DNS is working. And I would encourage you when you do your lab just to take a quick peek at DNS and make sure that the records are present. So in this case, ESXi 4 was not there. And I want it there. I want to make sure all the ESXi and vCenter devices have full name resolution capabilities between each other. And now, based on this DNS, they do. All right, so we'll go ahead and close that. I'll close Server Manager, and then we'll launch the installer for vCenter Server Appliance. So the D drive right here has the installer for vCenter Server Appliance. And I'll go to the UI installer folder right here. And so then from the vCSA UI installer folder, because I'm launching the installer from Windows, I'll go ahead and double click on the folder for launching it from Windows 32. And then I'll launch the installer by just double clicking right here on installer. And we are basically a part way there. I'd say halfway there, but the install takes a few minutes. So it'll take a few additional minutes once we get the ball rolling. So in the installer here, let me make this window a little bit bigger. In this installer, I have 4 options. I've got install, a brand new vCenter, upgrade, like to upgrade from a platform services controller or an older version of vCenter, and then I've got a migrate option and a restore option. In the event we have a catastrophe, we can restore from a backup and get our vCenter back up and running. So for now, we're going to do an install. So we'll click on install over here on the left, and it says, here you go. You can start stage 1, which is deploying the vCenter server. So we'll go ahead and click on next to continue. We'll accept the license agreement, click on next. And then it wants to know, where are you going to install this? So we're going to install the vCenter server appliance on ESXi 4. Now, because it's now in DNS, we can use the name here if we wanted to, or we could point to 192.168.1.104. This is just pointing to which ESXi host gets to be the home for this virtual machine. And we'll use the standard HTTPS port of 443. And now it's asking us, okay, how do I log into this ESXi host 4 to deploy this virtual machine on that guy? And this is the credentials we're supplying right here for the host, ESXi 4 in our case. That'll be the home for our vCenter server appliance. So we'll put the username of root, which is the King Kong user over on ESXi4, and we'll use our lab password once more. I just pasted it in from the lab tools, and we'll click on next to continue. So this Windows computer is connecting over now to ESXi4, and it's going to say, whoa, I get the self-signed certificate. Do you want to continue? So it's showing us this thumbprint. So if we wanted to, we could just run over to ESXi4, verify the thumbprint for the certificate, and if it matches, we can say, yep, we're talking to the right ESXi host. And you know what? That's worth a quick trip just to verify. Let's do that right now. So in the lab tools, I'm just going to pop over to the console for ESXi4 and hit F2 to enter the direct console user interface. We'll supply the lab password for ESXi4 and press enter. And then from the DCUI, we'll use the down arrow and go to view support information. And right here is showing us the SSL thumbprint right here, which starts with 52 and ends with A1. So we'd want to look at that whole string, but if the first two characters and last two characters match for the lab, I'm pretty sure we're on the right device. All right, let's go check the installer and verify that thumbprint. Starting with 52, ending with A1. So we'll go back to DCNUG, and sure enough, starting with 52 and ending with A1. We are talking to the right device. All right, so we'll go ahead and say that works and click on yes to continue. So we're going to deploy this virtual machine, the vCenter server appliance. What name do we want it to show up as on the ESXi host? And we're just going to call it vCSA. Then we're going to specify what the root password is going to be for that virtual machine. And so I'm going to use the lab password once more and submit that twice. Once to put it in, once to confirm, and then click on next. So if we ever need to log in as root to the vCenter server appliance, it's this password we're going to use. So we'll click on next to continue. All right, now it's asking us how much resource do you need for this vCenter server appliance, which is about to be created on ESXi4. So if we only plan to have up to 10 hosts that are going to be managed by this vCenter server, we could go ahead and less than 100 VMs, we could get away with only giving this VM, the vCenter server appliance, 2 virtual CPUs and 12 gigs of RAM and up to 463 gigs of storage. So we'd want to make sure that ESXi4 has the necessary oomph for that. So in the lab environment, we're not going to need to support hundreds of hosts. So we'll go ahead and we will select Tiny from the drop down here and click on Next. And now it's asking us, okay, what data store on this host on ESXi4 do you want to use? And we only have one data store at the moment. And I'm going to click on Use Thin Disk Mode. That basically means that even if we provision lots and lots of disk space, it's only going to tie up the physical disk space in that data store based on what vCenter server appliance is actually using. So we're going to do that. And oh my gosh, we're not going to make it. Look at this. The free space is only 20 gigs on that data store on ESXi4. We'll click on next and see what it thinks about that. And yeah, right here. Insufficient disk space. I need at least 25 gigs. So this is ESXi4 that doesn't have enough room. So let's fix that right now. Let's go out to ESXi4. I'm going to minimize the installer for a moment. I'll close File Explorer. We don't need that anymore. And I've got a little shortcut here for the host client for ESXi1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'm going to use this icon right here. Just double click on it to go ahead and launch the host client directly to ESXi4. We'll log in as root and we'll supply the lab password. All good. Click on Login. And then here, if we click on Storage, here it's just confirming we only have one data store. And there's not enough room to install our new vCenter server appliance. So we'll have some separate sets of videos on data stores to be sure and file systems and how that all works. But for right now, for this install, we need some more space. Now, fortunately, on ESXi4, there's an extra 120 gig hard disk just sitting there waiting for us. So I'm going to walk you through how easy it is to create a brand new data store that we can then use for the install of the vCenter server appliance. And it's done like this. Over here on storage, we simply right click on storage. And then from the drop down, select New Data Store right here. And then just follow the bouncing ball. Create a new VMFS data store, which is the VM file system data store. We'll click on Next. We'll go ahead and give it a name. Let's give it a name like DS, short for data store, _4_, and we'll call it vCSA. And that'll be just a data store just used for that VM, or at least can be used by that VM. And we'll click on Next. And then we're going to click Next a few times and finish. And then Yes. And then it's done. And now we have this new data store called DS4 vCSA. So I'm going to minimize this host client in case we need to come back to ESXi4. And we'll go back to the installer and click on the installer again. And I'm going to click on back. And then I'm going to click on next. And now, it now sees that new data store on ESXi4. We can click on it to select it, make sure thin disk mode is enabled there, and then click on next to continue. All right, now it's asking us for some of the details about the VM itself, the vCenter server appliance once it's deployed. What network do you want to connect to? At the moment, we just have one. That's fine. We'll use it. What flavor of IP do you want to use? We'll use IPv4. We're going to do a static IP address assignment. So we'll specify 192.168.1.111. So that's going to be the IP address based on our plan that's going to be used by the vCenter server appliance. And the associated mask with that is a 24-bit mask. And that's how we spell 24 bits, just like that. And for its fully qualified domain name, now if we didn't supply this, that's why it says optional, what it would do, the install would do a reverse lookup. It would say, hey, what's the name behind 192.168.1.111? And then it would use that as the name. However, because we know what that name is, we can go ahead and just put it in here, which is vcsa.nuggetlab.com. Fantastic. And then we'll also specify a default gateway, which is 192.168.1.1. Okay, and then a DNS server, which is 192.168.1.100. All right, then we'll scroll down, and the default ports for HTTP and HTTPS are being used. Those are great. And we'll click on Next to continue. Here we go. All right, this is a summary. Let me just verify our work here. If I scroll up, I've got the IP address of the host we're going to deploy this VM on. The deployment size is tiny, meaning it won't tie up as much resources. And if we scroll down a little bit, the data store on ESXi4 we're going to use is this data store. The thin just means it's not going to tie up all the disk space that's provisioned for that VM, but it's rather only going to tie up literally behind the scenes only the disk stores that it needs to. And then the network and the IP address and the host name it's going to have and its mask and default gateway and DNS, that all looks good. And we'll click on Finish. And it's now deploying the vCenter server appliance. This is stage 1. Now, when this is done, it'll come back and say, congratulations, or hopefully it'll say, congratulations, stage 1 is done. Now continue to stage 2, which is going to ask us some additional questions about the configuration for the VM itself. And while it's deploying the actual VM, let's take a moment and let me share with you some troubleshooting. If the deployment of the vCenter server is not working, there are a few things I'd have you check. Number 1 is DNS. Make sure you have forward and reverse lookups for every entity in the vSphere, meaning the vCenter server and all the ESXi hosts. So that's the first element, DNS. The second option, or the second thing I would talk about is DNS. So many people forget to make sure all those pieces are there. It is critical, and that's why in the lab that is coming up at the end of the set of videos, I'm going to have you go in and check DNS. And if there's something missing, I would like you to add it, just like we did in this video. The third thing would be time synchronization. Time keeps on slipping into the future. And it's okay if time slips into the future, as long as all the devices are synchronized with the time. And that's why we're going to point all of our devices to NTP servers. We did before with ESXi when we deployed those, syncing time, and we're going to do the same thing with the vCenter server appliance, is we're going to sync it to an NTP server, and that's coming up in stage 2. The other element would be the images that we're going to use. If you're rolling out vCenter and ESXi for the first time, make sure you're using compatible images. So if it's like update 2 for vCenter and there's update 2 for the ESXi installer, that's a good thing. And so if you have like one version is this and the other, sometimes it doesn't always work out, or sometimes images get so old that they no longer install properly. So just make sure those 3 things are checked and you should be good to go. DNS, time sync, and having the current images directly from VMware. And verify the hashes as we discussed in the videos about installing the ESXi host. All right, so I'm going to let this stage 1 continue. When it's done, we'll pick right back up and we'll move right into stage 2. See you in a moment for that. And when you're doing this lab in a few videos from now, while it's installing, if you want to open up the host client, so if we go ahead and just minimize the installer, let it continue to work, and if we go to the host client on ESXi4, so this is the ESXi host, which is getting the new virtual machine. So if you click down here on virtual machines, yeah, check that out. There's the vCenter server appliance. Now the install is still working and cranking on it, but this is also just fun to see, to verify that, okay, the VM is there. We can also click on monitor in the navigator pane over here, and you can look at the CPU utilization and the memory utilization and the network utilization. which is all a result of the deployment of that virtual machine. And let's go back to the installer, and here it'll be done in just a moment. All right, it's almost done. I can feel it. It's coming. And when it finishes, we'll go right into stage 2, which is the initial configuration for the vCenter server appliance. All right, we have stage 1 complete. Now it's just saying we need to continue with stage 2 for additional configuration of that vCenter server appliance that was just deployed over on ESXi4. So we'll click on continue. It's loading up stage 2, and here we go. And it's just telling us we're in stage 2, and we'll click on next to continue. As far as time synchronization, I want to synchronize with an NTP server, not just with the host that I'm running on. So we'll put in our NTP server. So again, that IP address of .100 is NTP. It's going to be DNS, and also when we get to Active Directory, it'll be that as well. And then SSH access, let's enable it. That way, if we ever need to SSH directly to this vCenter server appliance, it'll be enabled. And we'll click on next to continue. All right, now it's asking about the single sign-on configuration. Now, if this is a brand new implementation of vCenter, we're going to create a brand new single sign-on domain. If we were joining an existing single sign-on domain, let's say we have 2 vCenter servers and we want to be able to log in one time and then manage everything, what we would do is we could just join an existing one. So you specify the vCenter server that's already in that single sign-on domain. You specify the password for that administrator, and that would have you join that existing single sign-on domain. But for us, we're going to create a new one because it's a brand new install, and then we're going to specify our domain. Now, this is really important. We are currently, in this lab, it's currently using nuggetlab.com for Active Directory. That's the Active Directory domain. We do not want to use the same domain here, because if we do, we're going to have problems later. So we're going to want to use some domain name for our single sign-on for vSphere that's unique and different from our Active Directory domain. So for this lab, I'm just going to use vSphere.local. And that way, whenever we see that, we'll know, oh, that's the single sign-on domain for vSphere. And it's absolutely different than our nuggetlab.com domain. And then we're going to specify what is the administrator password for vCenter. Now, you might be thinking, well, Keith, wait a sec, we specified like a password earlier in the install, and that was for the root account for the vCenter server appliance. What this is going to be the administrator password for vCenter. And so we're going to have 2 passwords or 2 accounts, the root account for managing the vCenter server appliance, and then the administrator account and its password for managing all of vCenter and all of our ESXi hosts and everything else. So I'm going to use the same lab password for both. In production, you may not want to use the same password for both root and for administrator, but for convenience, that's what we're going to do right here. So I will supply the password, our lab password here for administrator. So I'm going to just paste that from the lab tools over on the right, and then I'll put in that same password again, and we'll click on next to continue. Now it's giving us the opportunity to join the Customer Experience Improvement Program for this lab. I'm going to say nope, but thank you for the offer, and click on next. All right, so here's a summary of all the details, and I'm just going to scan them real quick to make sure. So we're going to use the IP address of .111 for this vCenter server appliance. The host name is vcsa.nuggetlab.com. The gateway is .1. The DNS server is .100. NTP server is also .100. We're doing NTP synchronization for time. That looks all great, and we'll click on Finish. Then it says, you will not be able to stop or pause the install from completing once it started. And I would disagree. We could power off everything, and that would definitely stop it. But the point here is that once we commit, it's going to just go, and there's no middle ground to stop cleanly anywhere through. All right, so that being said, let's click on OK. So now that it's started, which is great, it's the bar is moving. What we'll do is we'll come back once this configuration is done, and I'll walk you through what the next steps are. Also, during stage 2, if you want to, you can take a peek at what's going on by going back to the host client and going to Monitor, and then it'll show you information regarding under the Performance tab, CPU, memory, which has just gone up. That's because that memory is being used by the vCenter server appliance, and network. So that's also interesting to see, just to verify that the work is being done and it's all being set up on that ESXi host. Once vCenter is up and running, we can then use the vSphere client interacting with vCenter to monitor and manage and work with all of our ESXi hosts via vCenter. So let me go ahead and minimize that. And this stage 2 is 67% done, and we'll let it complete. All right, it's getting close. The install is almost done. All right, it says stage 2 is complete. Yay! And to now manage the vCenter, we can go ahead and log in via https://vcsa.nuggetlab.com:443. Now that's the default port. And also, if we just hit the IP address as well, it would redirect us to HTTPS as well. And when we connect to this address, what we're going to be using is the vSphere client, which gives us the ability to work with and manage our entire vSphere environment once we add the ESXi hosts into the fold. So let's go ahead and click on close, and let's bring up a browser. Let's close the host client. We don't need that anymore. And let's bring up a browser again. And because we know DNS works, we could go to the name vcsa.nuggetlab.com. Here in my lab, that'll take us to the vCenter server. And if we press enter, it's redirecting us to the HTTPS flavor of that. And because it's a self-signed certificate, this computer can't verify the certificate. That's okay. We'll click on advanced, scroll down, and click on proceed anyway. And this is saying launch the vSphere client. I thought that's what we just did. So if we click on launch the vSphere client and check out what it did, it actually added a UI there. It's vcsa.nuggetlab.com/UI for user interface. And now we'll log on as our administrators. This is administrator at, and we'll specify our single sign-on domain for vSphere, which was vSphere.local. And then for our password, we'll supply our lab password and click on login. And there's that URL once again with the UI after it, vcsa.nuggetlab.com/UI. And this is the vSphere client. And here it says we have a CPU exhaustion on vCSA. I'm going to click on reset to green to get rid of that. And I've got a VMware AV API endpoint service health alarm. I'm going to click on reset to green to get rid of that. It's also telling us that we have licenses that have either expired or are expiring. That's because we're using an eval license. We just installed this. And we are going to be spending most of our time with this interface, with the vSphere client interface, as we work with and manage the vSphere environment with the ESXi host that we bring in. And as far as licensing goes, if we click on menu right here, one way of getting to administration is from the menu and using the drop down to administration right here. And then in administration on the left in the navigation pane, we have an option for licensing, or a section for licensing, I should say. If we click on that, it's going to show us here where we can add our licenses. So currently we've got an evaluation license that comes by default when you install vCenter. And so to apply licenses, what we could do is simply click on add, and we would just plug in the license key. So if we had a license for vCenter, you'd plug that in. If you have license for ESXi host, you'd plug those in. If you have licenses for vSAN, you'd plug those in. And then with those licenses in place, we can then associate those licenses with the platforms. We can associate the vCenter license with the vCenter server. Boom. We can associate, once we bring in ESXi host, we can associate the ESXi host licenses with those ESXi hosts. So we can manage all of our licenses right here from within vCenter. So let me go ahead and click on cancel for the moment. Now, most of the time, you and I are going to be logged into this interface, which is the vSphere client, not the host client. This is the vSphere client that's used to connect to vCenter to manage our entire enterprise. And to do that, we're using the default account of administrator, which we set the password up for. However, there may be times when we need to deal with the properties and the attributes of the vCenter server appliance itself, not vSphere and administering all that, but the appliance itself. And to do that, we're going to use the root account, which we also specified a password for. So in the next video, let me share with you how we can access the appliance from a perspective of management using the management interface and that root account. And we'll take a look at that in the next video. So I'll see you there in just a moment. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.